It is one of the most familiar buildings in the world. Symbol of a nation, alive with images of its history. Center of significant decisions that have shaped the past and will shape the future. It is the home of America's presidents, 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue, Washington, D.C., known simply as the White House.
Welcome to the White House. Thank you for joining me in the White House Library. 200 years ago, when John and Abigail Adams were the house's first occupants, this space was known simply as Room 17. At that time, Room 17 was the Executive Mansion's official laundry room. Here, Mrs. Adams' staff walked across what was then a dirt floor to collect the family's clean laundry. Over the next 101 years, the White House changed and grew along with our nation. By 1902, Room 17 had become President Theodore Roosevelt's smoking lounge, where gentlemen guests gathered before adjourning to the stately East Room on official occasions. Then, in 1935, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt changed the room again, this time into a library. Mrs. Jacqueline Kennedy refurbished the library in 1961, adding Duncan Fife furniture and, appropriately, a chandelier from the home of American novelist James Fenimore Cooper. Today, this room contains more than 2,700 volumes of Americana, enough tales and testimonies to fill several corners of the imagination. For this former librarian, I can't think of a better use of space. Like the volumes on these shelves, this house reflects the great story of America. The history of the White House within these walls is your history, and President Bush and I are honored to share it with you. Again, welcome to the White House. Welcome to the People's House. I hope you enjoy your visit.
It was built to be changed with a growing nation. In 1791, George Washington selected the site for what was to become the President's House. It would stand in the heart of America's new capital city. In an open competition, architect James Hoban submitted the winning design and was hired to supervise its construction. Modest by European standards, the simple but dignified box-like structure was larger than any house in America. It would remain so until after the Civil War. Actually, it was only 1/5 the size of the original proposal, but it was a house that would grow with the nation. George Washington was out of office before the White House was completed, the only president who did not live here. Today, the White House is a complex of buildings, which over the years have sprung from the original structure, a house that once served all the president's official and residential needs. The residence alone, in the center of this view from the north, now has a staff of over 100 who maintain its 132 rooms and 18 surrounding acres. On the first floor, the State Floor, are several elegant rooms used largely for official entertaining by the President and the First Lady. On the ground floor are a number of smaller rooms where guests are also received. Upstairs are the private living quarters of the First Family and their guests. For many years, this space also housed the offices of the president and his staff. Today, those offices are located in the West Wing, as are meeting and communications rooms for the Cabinet and the National Security Council. Outside the West Wing is where television reporters broadcast White House news to viewers around the world. In the East Wing are the offices of the First Lady's staff and the arrival area for visitors. Joining the wings to the main house, now from this southern view, are the East and West colonnades. In the East colonnade is a small theater, and in the West is the press room where journalists receive official White House briefings. The colonnades were added by President Thomas Jefferson in 1808 to conceal storage space and stables. They were the first architectural change to the president's house. The War of 1812 brought unplanned changes. President James Madison was away with the army when British troops invaded Washington and set the White House on fire. Only a heavy rainstorm saved the outer stone walls. The interior was destroyed. After the rebuilding, President James Monroe embellished the surviving exterior with the columned south portico. 2 administrations later, President Andrew Jackson built a second portico to the north, and the White House became the structure that is recognized today. As in every home, changes at the White House have reflected the fashions of the time and have improved its livability. Gas lighting was introduced by President James K. Polk. The first bathtub in the family quarters was installed for President Franklin Pierce. Rutherford B. Hayes was the first president to use a telephone in the White House. And electricity was introduced by President Benjamin Harrison. For some time, it had been clear the building was too small. Some suggested it be abandoned, and others unveiled elaborate plans for expansion. Finally, in 1902, President Theodore Roosevelt ordered the demolition of an array of greenhouses to make room for a new West Wing. Offices would no longer be crowded into the family quarters. By 1902, the main building of the White House had suffered 100 years of wear and tear. A major restoration was begun. Less than half a century later, more extreme measures would be required. President Harry S. Truman couldn't have known what lay ahead when he added his controversial second-floor balcony to the south portico in 1948. Just 1 year later, and for the second time in its history, the White House would be reduced to a shell, this time by choice. The building's timber structure could no longer support its weight. Some suggested the mansion was standing up purely by habit. During more than 3 years of construction, the White House was methodically dismantled. Only the outer stone walls and roof remained. Hundreds of workers excavated a new 2-story basement, laid new foundations, and rebuilt the interior with modern materials. When President Truman returned, he showed the rebuilt White House to a national audience on television. In a live broadcast, the president guided viewers through several of the newly restored rooms. He told stories and even stopped to play the piano. It was the first time a mass audience got a look inside the White House. Unless you count the time President Franklin Roosevelt's Scottish Terrier, Fala, starred in this 1940 motion picture featurette. By 1962, almost all Americans had TV sets when First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy led her televised tour. The broadcast sparked new public interest in the White House as a national treasure. Mrs. Kennedy stressed the importance of a permanent collection of fine furnishings, art, and antiques that reflect the rich history of the president's house. Visitors from around the world have long been drawn to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. It is still the only residence of a head of state open to the public on a regular basis and free of charge. More than 1 million visitors come each year and carry away their own special memories of this historic place. As the last group of visitors departs from the North Portico, the staff begins preparation of the state floor for the rest of the day's activities. It might be a luncheon, a conference, a musical performance, or the arrival of a visiting head of state. Here in the entrance hall, many official functions begin. Presidents, first ladies, and their guests descend the grand staircase and pause for photographers. The Marine Band plays Hail to the Chief, an old Scottish anthem suggested by First Lady Sarah Polk. President Polk was not a large man, and his wife wanted to make sure his entrances did not go unnoticed. Today's entrance hall is similar to James Hoban's original design, but it has not always had the appearance of elegant simplicity. A stained glass partition once separated the main entrance hall from the adjacent cross hall. It was created for President Chester A. Arthur by decorator Louis C. Tiffany, in part to make the building easier to heat. Today, this beautiful reception area with its marble walls, floors, and columns often doubles as an informal ballroom. But most White House social events take place in the mansion's largest room, the East Room. Because the East Room is used for many large gatherings, it is sparsely furnished. Aside from its huge chandeliers, which have always been the room's trademark, the most noticeable object here is the 1938 Steinway piano, the very same piano played by President Truman during his televised tour. It is supported by gilded American eagles and features gold stenciled scenes from the history of American folk music. The piano is still used today and is an important part of the rich musical history of the White House. And here in the East Room hangs the most important possession in the White House, this famous portrait of George Washington by Gilbert Stuart. It is the only object that has remained in the White House collection since the mansion was first occupied in 1800. During the War of 1812, First Lady Dolly Madison refused to flee the approaching British troops until the portrait was removed to safety. The vast space between these East Room walls has served many purposes, but perhaps the most surprising was its initial use. First Lady Abigail Adams found the East Room the ideal place to hang the wash to dry. As the mansion's first residents, John and Abigail Adams were simply trying to make the best of an unfinished home. Union troops were given shelter here by President Abraham Lincoln at the beginning of the Civil War. 4 years later, Lincoln was assassinated, and this same room became the site of his funeral. 7 of the 8 presidents who have died while in office have lain in state in the East Room, including President Warren G. Harding and President John F. Kennedy. Among happier White House occasions have been the weddings that have been held in the East Room, including the marriage of Ulysses S. Grant's daughter Nellie in 1874. One of the room's most extreme transformations had just been completed. False beams were installed across the ceiling, and the entire room was decorated in a style referred to by some as Steamboat Gothic. The room had been returned to a simpler, more stately appearance well before President Lyndon B. Johnson's daughter Linda was married here in 1967. The look of the East Room has changed and changed again, but it has always been that place where the President of the United States welcomes large groups of visitors for an evening of entertainment or for the announcement of a remarkable achievement. Three smaller reception rooms in the center of the state floor have been furnished in styles popular during the years of our earliest presidents. The Green Room is finished in the federal style, named for the beginning years of our government under the Constitution. At times, it has been a card room, a bedroom, and even President Jefferson's dining room. But throughout most of its history, the Green Room has been a parlor for small teas and receptions, and that is how it is used today. Most of the handsome mahogany furniture in the Green Room was handcrafted by one of America's greatest cabinet makers, Duncan Pfeiffer. His designs were often as clever as they were elegant. This handsome work table is full of surprises. A variety of hidden compartments open to reveal storage areas and working surfaces for fine sewing or the painting of miniatures. This silver coffee urn was one of the most prized possessions of America's second president, John Adams. A close look reveals the engraved initials of John and Abigail Adams. This beautiful Italian marble mantelpiece is one of a pair that were installed in the White House after the fire of 1814. Its twin is in the Red Room. Above the mantel hangs the portrait of a scholarly, aging Benjamin Franklin, posed with a bust of Isaac Newton, symbolizing Franklin's interest in the sciences. A portrait of William Henry Harrison also hangs in the Green Room. General Harrison was the first American president to die in office. He had served for just 1 month. The paintings in the Green Room are among the most treasured in the entire White House collection. Several depict scenes of 19th century America. The Oval Blue Room is the most formal of the White House reception rooms. George Washington had been especially fond of an oval-shaped room in his temporary presidential residence in Philadelphia. Perhaps, to make sure his design would please Washington, James Holman gave the White House not one oval room, but 3. Directly above the Blue Room is the yellow Oval Room, the sitting room of the family quarters. And below is the diplomatic reception room. It was from here that President Franklin Roosevelt broadcast his famous fireside chats. The Blue Room is decorated in the French style of Napoleon, called Empire, chosen by President James Monroe in 1818 after the White House had been rebuilt. These sturdy gilded furnishings are among the oldest in the White House, and are some of the most important antiques in America. The man selected by Monroe to paint his portrait, which now hangs in the Blue Room, is not well known as an artist. The painter was Samuel F.B. Morse, inventor of the telegraph. The Blue Room was so named in 1837 when President Martin Van Buren first decorated it in blue. Throughout its history, presidents and first ladies have held formal White House receptions here. One of its most glorious celebrations was the marriage of President Grover Cleveland to Frances Folsom in 1886. Cleveland has been the only president to be married in the White House. The Blue Room has long been considered the most beautiful room in the White House. It also has its best view. The curved wall of windows, once converted into an entranceway by President John Adams, overlooks the expansive South grounds. To one side is the Washington Monument. The Jefferson Memorial lies in the distance. The South Lawn has been the scene of many festive White House events, from the welcoming of a visiting head of state to the annual Easter egg roll, attracting children of all ages for over 100 years. And the South Lawn has been the location of more physical activities, including President George Bush's Great American Workout. Back in the 1930s, President Herbert Hoover engaged his staff in athletic endeavors. They became known as the Medicine Ball Cabinet. President Woodrow Wilson encouraged his cabinet to stay in shape with outdoor calisthenics. And in a gesture to keep the economy in shape during the First World War, Wilson brought a flock of sheep to the South Lawn to cut the grass. The sheep conserved manpower, and their wool was auctioned off to provide funds for the Red Cross. One of the first sound films ever made featured President Calvin Coolidge. It was filmed right here on the White House grounds.
Is economy in government.
But perhaps the most surprising use of the South Lawn was for an amazing demonstration. The auto gyro was test landed here in the late 1920s, some 25 years before presidential helicopters became routine. The Red Room is decorated in the American Empire style from the period between 1810 and 1830. These fine furnishings combine richly carved mahogany with decorative bronze hardware, and often include fanciful animal forms. Influenced by ancient Egyptian design, this furniture was manufactured by cabinet makers in New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. American Empire was most popular during the terms of Presidents Andrew Jackson and Martin Van Buren. This Empire music stand holds sheet music for President Jackson's Grand March. It represents the long tradition of musical performance in the Red Room. A variety of musical instruments have been kept here since the early 1800s. White House guests often referred to the Red Room as the music room. The Red Room has long been a favorite of first ladies, their private parlor in which to receive friends and official callers. Angelica Singleton Van Buren was not a first lady, but in the 1830s she was a prominent White House hostess. This Southern belle assisted her father-in-law, who was a widower. The bust of President Martin Van Buren within the portrait now hangs on the Red Room's south wall. President Ulysses S. Grant would sometimes bring visiting dignitaries to the Red Room to be presented to his wife and her guests. The Grand Duke Alexis of Russia was received here in 1871. It was President Grant who staged one of this room's most unusual events. He arranged for his successor, Rutherford B. Hayes, to be secretly sworn into office here 2 nights before the public ceremony at the Capitol. Hayes' election had been bitterly contested, and fearing a coup, Grant took no chances. The state dining room has undergone relatively few changes since the beginning of the century, but earlier it served a variety of purposes. It was Thomas Jefferson's office and James Monroe's cabinet room. In those days, the room was much smaller. During Theodore Roosevelt's 1902 renovation, this staircase in the adjacent hallway was removed. The additional space greatly enlarged the state dining room. Before the renovation, the room looked like this. And afterward, it looked like this. Not all presidents were as fond of living with big game trophies as was Theodore Roosevelt. When Woodrow Wilson used the state dining room, he positioned himself so that he could not see them. They were finally removed. Except for a coat of paint on the wood paneling, the room has looked much the same ever since. This mantel is a reproduction in marble of the original design for Theodore Roosevelt. When first installed, its corner blocks displayed carved lions. Roosevelt ordered them changed. Buffalo, he said, were much more appropriate for an American president. The inscription is from a letter written by President John Adams just 2 days after he became the mansion's first occupant. Adams wrote, "I pray heaven to bestow the best of blessings on this house, and all that shall hereafter inhabit it. May none but honest and wise men ever rule under this roof." Just above hangs a portrait of President Abraham Lincoln. It was painted 4 years after his death. It was given to the White House in 1939 by the Lincoln family. Over the years, thousands have been entertained in the state dining room at a variety of luncheons, dinners, and receptions. These events continue to be the room's primary use today. Some 30 formal White House dinners are held here each year, attended by up to 140 guests. Each place setting includes as many as 27 individual items, among them the distinctive White House china. Presidents have received government funds to purchase state china since 1817, when James Monroe acquired this setting, now part of the White House collection. The pieces in this collection represent almost every administration, including that of President Rutherford B. Hayes, whose taste was most unique. The meals served in the state dining room are created 1 floor below, in a kitchen surprisingly more compact than those in most restaurants. The menu is selected especially for the occasion by the White House chef, the social secretary, and the First Lady. Down the hall, the floral shop bustles with activity. Staff designers create the beautiful arrangements that have long given the tables of the state dining room that traditional touch of elegance. The same team furnishes the entire White House with fresh flowers year-round. In view of the state dining room is another source of floral beauty. The Rose Garden continues a tradition of White House gardens that began back in its earliest days. Mrs. Woodrow Wilson created the first Rose Garden here in 1913. Some 50 years later, its current design was established by President John F. Kennedy, who used this outdoor stage to honor Alan Shepard, America's first man in space. In the first Rose Garden wedding, President Richard Nixon's daughter, Tricia, exchanged vows with Edward Cox in 1971. An earlier display of unity in this setting brought Winston Churchill together with Franklin Roosevelt for an historic World War II meeting of the Allied War Council. Overlooking the Rose Garden from the West Wing is that place where some of the greatest concerns of the American people have been addressed. Perhaps the most recognizable room in the White House, it is, of course, the President's Oval Office. And so it continues, today, tomorrow, in years to come. The torch is passed, and another president works to carry out the challenges of his office.
Serving in this office and residing in this house is an extraordinary privilege. Every occupant of the White House is aware of its dignity and grace, its promise and history. You have learned about some of the history in the last 30 minutes. Each room in the White House serves as a reminder of the great events that have shaped the history of America and the history of the world. This is where a president set in motion the end of the awful practice of slavery. This is where presidents directed wars against fascism and tyranny, where they helped end the Great Depression, secured civil rights for all Americans, and prevailed in the Cold War. I am honored and humbled to live and work in the place where so many great American leaders have fought for our democratic ideals. The White House represents the American promise, a promise of liberty and freedom for all. Those who live here may have different philosophies, but they share a common commitment to the people and the ideals of our country. 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue is the permanent address of the people and the temporary home of their leaders. Laura and I are proud the doors are open to those who wish to visit. This house belongs to you, the proud citizens of the United States of America.
General Motors are proud to help make possible this video tour of our President's home. Funding this film is part of General Motors' commitment to quality television and video arts. Another Mark of Excellence presentation.